Welcome everyone to Psychedelia Integration. For people that are not familiar with us, we're a Los Angeles-based psychedelic organization since 2016. We were founded by Cherie Malcolm Gadassi, providing education and support using a harm reduction approach for those using psychedelics. And we always request that you use psychedelics wisely, and we're here to help show you how that works, how to do that. Tonight, we're really excited to have Ben Malcolm, psychopharmacologist. He's going to be talking about breakthrough pharmacology, ketamine, MDMA, and psilocybin. So ketamine, MDMA, and psilocybin have been granted breakthrough designations for psychiatric conditions by the Food and Drug Administration. In this talk, Ben will be discussing the pharmacology of each of these compounds with a special focus on comparing and contrasting their mechanisms of action, safety profiles, indications, and usage, as well as drug interaction potential. This will be really wonderful since these are the three hot psychedelics, so to speak, in the space right now. And so a little bit about Ben, in case you don't know Ben. Dr. Ben Malcolm earned his bachelor's degree in pharmacology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, prior to his master's in public health and doctorate of pharmacy at Touro University in California. He then completed postgraduate residencies in acute care at Scripps Mercy Hospital and psychiatric pharmacy at the University of California, San Diego Health. And after residency training, he began his career as an academician at Western University of Health Sciences College of Pharmacology and obtained board certification in psychiatric pharmacy. Currently, he provides psychopharmacology consulting services and is a resource and support membership, has a resource and support membership relating to the use of psychedelic and psychotropic medications at spiritpharmacist.com. Do check that out for any drug indications and considerations about working with psychedelics. Ben is the person to talk to. And Dr. Malcolm envisions a society which access to psychedelic drugs in a variety of safe and supported settings is available for purposes of psychospiritual well-being, personal development, ceremonial sacraments, and treatment of mental illness. His vision guides his scholarship, education, and service-related professional activity. And I'm really pleased to introduce Ben. And welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Paul. It's wonderful to be here. Yeah. I haven't given a talk for psychedelia in quite a while. I want to say that it was the Psychedelic Psychopharmacology series I did. I think it was either 5 or 6 talks on a monthly basis, but that was way back at the end of 2019. That was pre-pandemic kind of times. So we're truly in a different dimension here. And for the people that maybe just got here, or if you haven't checked out the chat yet, if you scroll up to the top, the second message I sent to everyone is like a PDF of the slides that I'm going to be presenting. So if you would like a copy of those or want to have them open as you go through the talk tonight, they're there for you to download. So I was going to stick with kind of the same stuff that I usually talk about, but I'm going to go a little bit off script here tonight and get a little bit speculative with you all in the second half of the talk. And this is at the request of Paul. He really wanted to know about combining these types of substances and what the effects of those combinations may have, what would be the rationale for doing it. And so I'm going to introduce the compounds in the first half of the talk, and then I'm going to switch gears and sort of talk about combinations. And hopefully we'll have a good amount of time left at the end for question and answer. So a little bit as far as the disclaimers here is that I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose, like financially. I don't work for any of these companies that are developing these types of entities. I am a psychedelia board member, so I'm invested in this organization, but I do not predict that that would impact the talk or the information here tonight so much. And of course, I'm not recommending that you break the law. I kind of outlined our journey already tonight, introducing the substances, doing a little bit about their mechanism of action and comparing the substances, and then talking a little bit how they interface with standard psychotropic medications. And I think that will tee us up nicely for the second half, kind of exploring what different combinations of these three things might do differently than each substance alone. So the breakthrough substances, and Paul already stole my thunder here in that, these substances are designated as breakthroughs by the Food and Drug Administration or the FDA. So the FDA designates substances as breakthrough substances when they seem to offer something novel or new, or they seem to be substantial improvements over existing therapies and or address like unmet therapeutic needs. So your standard sort of psychotropic medications or SSRIs work all right for depression or anxiety, but when you start thinking about PTSD, OCD, eating disorders, substance use disorders, they really don't work so well there. And so there's a huge unmet treatment need in psychiatry for novel and new treatments, and that's exactly what these three compounds do or are. So the research has been accumulating, and so far it's positive, and the benefits seem unprecedented as far as looking at clinical trials and the types of results people are getting and the effect sizes that you see in those studies. It's typically studied for unmet treatment needs. So treatment-resistant depression, people that are not responding to standard types of treatments, and I mentioned PTSD and OCD as well. They're really attractive for a lot of different reasons, right? Is that they have rapid and robust effects as they work almost immediately, or within 24 hours, you're seeing really large reductions in symptoms, whereas this kind of first-line treatments, those SSRI or SNRI types of antidepressants, typically take at least days, if not weeks, to even a month or two to really come to a full type of therapeutic effect. The psychedelics are used intermittently, so they're not used on a daily basis. That's obviously an advantage. You always want to expose people to the minimum amount of substance needed to feel better. Limited number of administrations. So far, these trials are pretty finite, and that depending on which substance you're using, ketamine, a few more treatments, Mdma and psilocybin, very few treatments. But the idea of limited administrations needed for really large and durable, persistent types of benefits is obviously a really attractive thing. And I really think that the risks associated with psychedelics are, there could be some physical risks, right? If you're using large doses of MDMA or large doses of ketamine in persons that have advanced cardiovascular conditions or poor liver function or things like this. But I think probably the primary risks for the average adult is going to be associated with the non-ordinary state of consciousness that they produce themselves, is that they're very strong psychoactive substances. They render states in which persons can become confused or suspicious. They can also be extremely emotional, vulnerable, or suggestible in these types of states. So there's plenty of room for them to get into this kind of neuroplastic or moldable type of state that the psychedelic produces and come into a mold that doesn't really serve them well. I mentioned that they're breakthroughs. So words describing psychedelics, I'm not really going to go through each and every single one of these words because I think that the audience is probably pretty familiar with a lot of them. But I'm describing these three things, right? Breakthrough psychedelics, MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, and I'm describing them under the umbrella term psychedelic, which means mind or soul manifesting. And you may find people that would take point to that and say, well, you know what? Psilocybin is really the only true psychedelic here. MDMA is an enactogen or an empathogen. It doesn't really have these hallucinogenic types of effects to it. Or you may say that, well, ketamine, it's an anesthetic, it's a dissociative type of anesthetic. So, this isn't really a psychedelic at all. So I'm considering psychedelic to be more of an umbrella term in that it reveals something about how the mind works, and it produces a type of state that is non-ordinary or different than what the person experiences most of the time in their waking life. And so I'm putting psychedelic in this talk as sort of an umbrella term, but I think some of the other more specific terms that tend to fit these different substances perhaps a little better than one another may come into play when we start thinking about combinations and where we essentially want to go with our experience or the specific kind of combination. And I'll say, I'm really excited about some of these terms that are being used today, like psychoplastogen or neuroplastogen. So speaking about a psychedelic substance, not from kind of a subjective perspective of what it's supposed to make you feel like, or an observer's perspective of psychotomimetic, what an observer may see in someone under the influence, but more of a neurobiological type of effect. And I think that these terms are very important in the sorts of efforts of destigmatizing psychedelics and really kind of getting to the heart of, well, what is it really doing on a neurological basis that you could use to kind of explain some of the things that you see and the results that people are getting. So a little bit of a comparison between our three breakthrough psychedelics here, and they're all in a different chemical class. MDMA and psilocybin are both serotonin-based or serotonergic psychedelics. MDMA is probably your flagship synthetic prototype of a phenethylamine psychedelic, and phenethylamine is essentially a chemical backbone that mimics catecholamine neurotransmitters like norepinephrine or dopamine. MDMA works by releasing serotonin. It does bind serotonin 2A receptors, but it probably works primarily by releasing serotonin. It also has some really interesting neurohormonal types of effects to it. Can result in vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, as well as oxytocin, which is a social bonding type of neuropeptide. So these can be released upon MDMA. So MDMA kind of has a more complex mechanism of action compared to psilocybin, but I tend to really think of it as a serotonergic amphetamine, or an amphetamine that's able to release serotonin primarily. So far, it's been used in PTSD mostly. This is the indication that MAPS has really gone the farthest with, and we'll probably get it approved in the next year or two for that indication. Well, there is a positive study for alcohol use disorder, social anxiety, and autistic results. And I believe there's also one for depression, anxiety, and life-threatening illness out there with MDMA as well. So MDMA is more of an enactogen or an empathogen. So less of this kind of mystical experience or ego dissolutive type of effect. Usually in a moderate dose of MDMA, the person will know who they are and really retain this kind of sense of self, although the kind of emotional landscape is opened up, and they may feel more in touch with themselves and enactogenic, to like touch within type of quality, or they may be able to feel like they're more in touch with the emotions of other people, like an empathogenic type of quality. Well, metabolism, metabolized by a lot of different liver enzymes. That's what all these like CYP kind of things are. And I don't know, this row may look like a little bit of Greek to you, but I kind of list the primary enzyme first. So for MDMA, it would be CYP2D6. For psilocybin, it's a UGT enzyme, or it's a glucuronol transferase enzyme. And then ketamine has a variety, but probably CYP3A4 or CYP3A5. And instead of trying to memorize what these enzymes are and the different like rows of the chart, the kind of point is they all have different types of metabolic routes. So when I'm thinking about drug-drug interactions, one really kind of primary or cardinal way drugs interact is by interfering with the metabolism of one another. So what you could take away from this sort of metabolism row here is that the metabolic schemes of these three psychedelics are quite different from each other. So at least from a metabolic perspective, you're not really going to have much in the way of an interaction potential to worry about or consider. And we'll get to the psychodynamic type of effect in the interaction a bit later, but that's what I have to say about metabolism here. As far as physical safety, you could create different laundry lists of complaints that people have had about psychedelic experiences, either in their experience or in clinical trials. But kind of the high notes for MDMA is that it is a stimulant amphetamine. They have not had any cardiovascular events show up in clinical trials, but they've also screened and excluded people that have uncontrolled high blood pressures, advanced cardiovascular conditions. There have been age limits on the clinical trials. And when I do look at recreational type of literature, obviously ecstasy and MDMA, there's some apples and oranges to compare there, but you can find people having cardiovascular events sometimes using recreational ecstasy. MDMA is a C1 right now, but it's also which means an illicit substance, but it's also an experimental compound. So psilocybin is one of your flagship tryptamines. It's naturally occurring, and it's one of the four classic psychedelics, and three of those four classic psychedelics are also tryptamines. So it really is sort of like when people say the word psychedelic, like psilocybin is usually one of the first types of things people are thinking about, or sort of like foremost in their mind when they're using the term psychedelic. And tryptamines essentially mimic serotonin. Serotonin is a tryptamine. Oftentimes you'll see it abbreviated as 5-HT or 5-hydroxytryptamine. So you can think of psilocybin as a serotonin analog that binds many different serotonin receptors, but specifically the serotonin 2A receptor. And this one seems critical for psychedelic mechanisms of action. If you block that receptor with drugs that block it, like atypical antipsychotics, it vastly diminishes the effects of tryptamine psychedelics like psilocybin. This one, the breakthrough designation is treatment-resistant depression, although there's a really good amount of data, and the data looks great for depression and anxiety and life-threatening illness. So people that have more advanced medical illnesses and oftentimes cancers. So I think this sort of speaks to the overall safety profile of psilocybin, is that they're fairly comfortable even at this, I would say, fairly early stage of the third wave or the psychedelic renaissance, the reemergence of psychedelics in medical research, to see them kind of going that far into a population that has some really kind of serious medical illness issues going on too, I think really helps to understand or see the physical safety profile and the confidence those researchers have in the safety profile of psilocybin to be administering it in that kind of population. This one, if I was going to use other words besides a psychedelic, you may use a word like entheogen to cultivate the divine within, because psilocybin is the one that Johns Hopkins is really pushing to study as far as mystical effects, ego dissolutive type of effects, or a substance that causes essentially a non-dual experience or a dissolution of the subject-object relationship, an experience where the person becomes one with their surroundings, the universe at large, the natural world. Also, if I was going to use an old school type of term, you see the word hallucinogen still used, which is, I don't know, honestly, like pretty one-dimensional to think that, well, the only thing psilocybin does is generate hallucinations. And even that is kind of like, well, I mean, it's usually more like, patterns or like themes on what you're actually seeing, rather than like a frank hallucination where something just appears that wasn't actually there. But depending on the dose and who you talk to, you may find some people that have hallucinated pretty hard. Physical safety, I mentioned this is also a C1 or illicit type of compound right now, but it's experimental also, so it's in clinical trials. Now, ketamine is a completely different ball of wax. It's not serotonergic at all. It belongs to the aryl cyclohexylamine class of drugs. Another one that's out there that belongs to that class is PCP, or phencyclidine. And essentially, it's a glutamate blocker. It blocks glutamate receptors in a specific type of glutamate receptor called the Nmda receptor. This one is FDA approved at this point for treatment-resistant depression or bipolar depression. So this is one major advantage of ketamine compared to the serotonergic psychedelics. It's been studied, it's demonstrated that it has some pretty good efficacy in not only unipolar or major depression, but also bipolar depression, whereas the serotonergic psychedelics would still be considered to be fairly contraindicated in that type of population. Also, suicidal ideation. So this is huge in that there really is no treatment that is approved out there except for ketamine as far as rapid reduction of suicidal ideation. You can find some data, for example, showing that lithium tends to have an anti-suicidal type of effect to it, but it's not rapid or relatively immediate like ketamine seems to be. And there's mounting evidence for ketamine and other indications, PTSD, some anxiety disorders. Ketamine, besides being an anesthetic, it's also an analgesic, so it has some use in refractory types of pain conditions like complex regional pain syndrome. So kind of thinking about the overall constellation of, okay, this person has some type of mood disturbance, but what else is going on with them? Maybe they do have some chronic pain, and you're gravitated towards ketamine as a result. It's a dissociative, but dissociative to me simply means that it tends to separate mind and body. And when ketamine kind of first came onto the scene, it was sort of like, well, we shouldn't use ketamine in PTSD because it causes dissociation, and in PTSD sometimes people dissociate too. But I believe that this kind of fight, flight, or freeze dissociation, the dissociative response associated with trauma, is quite a bit different than the sort of dissociative response that you get from a ketamine experience. Cardiovascular disease, I can't really find a lot of papers demonstrating that ketamine is really high risk for people having heart attacks or strokes, but some people, particularly when they have like advanced coronary artery disease, really high blood pressures, uncontrolled high blood pressures, there could be some risk there. And this is not necessarily therapeutic ketamine, but in recreational settings, people using high doses pretty frequently often develop LUTs, or lower urinary tract symptoms. So things like urinary urgency, bladder pain, and sometimes even things like hemorrhagic cystitis. So this would be like a really inflamed bladder where there's actually blood showing up in the urine. This one's a C3 substance. So a little bit more in detail. I spent a lot of time comparing them on purpose here, so I'm going to go through the next few slides a little bit quicker. MDMA's mechanism of action, again, it's multifaceted, but I really think of it as the type of thing that primarily releases serotonin, also binds serotonin to a receptor. So this is probably where some of the really emotional, expansive types of effects, and some, if you push the dose of MDMA high enough, you did get some psychedelic types of effects to it as well. Neurohormonal effects. So this is really interesting, and that psychiatrists have been trying to use oxytocin as a drug for a long time, but because the neuropeptide is very polar, it does not penetrate the blood-brain barrier well at all. And so it's not going to be a very palatable type of treatment to get an injection directly into the central nervous system in order to get oxytocin in your brain, but perhaps using substances like MDMA that can cause a releasing of oxytocin would be the next best thing. So MDMA at serotonin synapses, essentially what you see here is that MDMA promotes the release of serotonin, and specifically it's called a carrier-mediated release. So it interferes with the packaging of serotonin into vesicles over at VMAT2. And what happens then is the serotonin reuptake pump, or SERT, reverses its normal flow. So the serotonin reuptake pump normally would uptake serotonin from the synapse, or the space between these two neurons, and take it back up into the presynaptic terminal. But under the influence of MDMA, this flow is reversed, and it's called a carrier-mediated release. So MDMA results in an increase in serotonin, an increase in intrasynaptic serotonin because of its releasing effects. And this is important because there's only so much serotonin that you can have in your synapse before it's excessive and things start to not go well. So for example, psilocybin doesn't release intrasynaptic, or doesn't increase intrasynaptic serotonin, and has the type of safety profile where the person would easily survive a 10-fold overdose, and probably also survive something like a 100-fold overdose, maybe even 1,000. I would never recommend people take doses that high, but when you're trying to think about what is the LD50, or what is the lethal dose of psilocybin, it's hard to come up with an estimate or a number. Whereas MDMA, being a serotonergic amphetamine that increases intrasynaptic serotonin, there's definitely an overdose limit to it. So, kind of thinking about, again, like combinations, is that, well, some people are sensitive to MDMA. Some people get like really kind of like nasty, sort of like hangover effects. The week after effects are not like great for them. So wouldn't it be wonderful if you could get away with just using a lower dose of MDMA and getting almost the same effect? It's like maybe you could do that by adding a little bit of psilocybin to the mix or something like that. So that'd be like one rationale for actually thinking about how you could potentially reduce some of the toxicity associated with MDMA. Not that it has high toxicity at moderate doses, of the types of doses they're using in clinical trials, right? But maybe you do have that individual that's sensitive and doesn't want to use a dose of MDMA that's in the kind of normal range. So psilocybin is not actually the drug that you trip out on. It's psilocin. Psilocybin is a prodrug. It is dephosphorylated by some esterases, phosphoesterases, either in the bloodstream or kind of in the small intestine. It's a non-specific serotonin agonist, so it's a serotonin analog. It looks just like serotonin, so its main action is binding to the same receptors that serotonin binds to. The psychedelic effects mostly mediated by serotonin 2A receptors, although some sources will also talk about 1A receptors or 2C receptors. It has some weak binding to these other targets, and I'm not really convinced that it plays much of a role in its mechanism of action or is clinically significant anyway, but you can find that it has a binding affinity to some of these other receptors. Much more simple, right? Psilocin at the serotonin 2A synapse. So you don't have this whole carrier-mediated release process going on. The amount of serotonin in the synapse is essentially unchanged, and the drug is primarily binding to the postsynaptic serotonin 2A receptors. It's really interesting, the type of signaling that occurs at these serotonin 2A receptors. It doesn't seem like it's a standard serotonin signal, because serotonin is not a psychedelic. Psilocybin and psilocin are, right? So it causes a different type of signaling at these receptors, which is really interesting phenomena, that drugs can bind to the same place in the receptor on the outside of the cell, but cause a different signaling cascade on the inside of the cell. It's called functional selectivity or biased agonism. And it's really an interesting phenomena. Ketamine, as far as its mechanism of action, is a glutamate receptor antagonist. And this is a pretty complex looking diagram here. And I'm not sure that it would be the best use of our time tonight to like really walk through it all, except this diagram is meant to depict some mechanisms involved in a process called long-term potentiation. And essentially, it's a learning mechanism. It's a synaptic plasticity mechanism. And it probably could be most simply summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. So what happens is that this Nmda receptor is a very special type of receptor. First of all, it leads electrical signal, like ligands binding to it, like glutamate and glycine, but it has this magnesium ion plugging its pore in the center. When that magnesium ion is removed, it lets not only sodium but calcium in. So this is also very strange for an ion channel, is that it would let an ion with a +1 charge, sodium, and an ion with a +2 charge in. Normally it's just one or the other, but not both. So it's a very strange type of receptor, the Nmda receptor. And calcium does all sorts of things on the insides of cells. So when an Nmda receptor is open, it actually causes, calcium causes the insertion of other glutamate receptors called AMPA receptors into the channel. And so what happens, right, is that you get more glutamate, the Nmda receptor gets fired up, and then you add more AMPA receptor and it's reinforced. There's a loop there now. So now when you get a little more glutamate, it's stronger and it understands the pattern from what happened before because of the amount of AMPA channels that are expressed on the membrane. So is there any type of overlap between these serotonergic psychedelics and ketamine? It seems like there is. So there's a lot of, I will say, like discussion about where in the brain these psychedelics are having their primary effects. And one portion of the brain that gets discussed a lot is layer 5 pyramidal cells of the cortex. And it seems that you've got a serotonergic psychedelic on the diagram in the top left and ketamine on the bottom left here. And they both result in glutamate release in that layer 5 pyramidal cortical neuron. And that they both result in increased neurotrophic factor expression within those neurons, or brain-derived neurotrophic factors. So there does seem to be a convergence of effects here that could give rise to a rationale of, well, perhaps a combination of these things that converge in the same target, converge in the same part of the cortex, parts of the prefrontal cortex that are part of that default mode network with the limbic system. Maybe there really is some rationale for an overlapping or combination type of being better. So before we get into combinations, I have to, my standard spiel, the hill that I stand on all the time is the psychedelics and psychiatric medications. And I'll say that many could diminish or modulate the effects of psychedelics. This isn't necessarily dangerous, except it's just a really big bummer for the person overall. And, if they're in a place where they're already feeling quite hopeless, I've tried everything, these psychedelics are my last hope. I really try and counsel people out of that mindset when I come across it, right? But a lot of people really have their hopes raised around psychedelics. So to have the experiences turn out very lackluster overall, it could leave them in a place that's not great psychologically as well. Others have potentially dangerous physiological effects in combination. Not too much with the serotonergic psychedelics, unless you're talking about like MAOI containing ones like ayahuasca or other psychedelics like ibogaine. But there are some, like lithium would be a medication that I would not combine with psilocybin or MDMA. But again, you can combine it with ketamine, and lithium's the kind of thing that also gets used to treat bipolar disorder. So again, like ketamine's big advantage here is that it can treat bipolar depression, a person's taking lithium, which would sort of be almost a double contraindication for something like MDMA or psilocybin. The data is usually lacking to inform optimal decision making. So really, like, my approach is I'm just using the best practices that I can find for medication tapering and just kind of taking it a step at a time from there, and then telling people as much as I possibly can about what the possible effects of the psychedelic could be and how that may interface with the effects of their taper. And so that's about the best that we have, but there's not a lot of great trials that look at different rates of tapering antidepressants and then when to introduce the psychedelics and things like that. So there's a huge gray area out there when it comes to medications interfacing with psychedelics at this point in time. So this is kind of your psychotropic psychedelic interactions with these three, I guess I put some other classic psychedelics in there too. There's LSD and DMT, but the three sort of breakthrough ones that we're focusing on tonight. You kind of notice across the board with SSRIs or SNRIs, I'm not really concerned about serotonin toxicity. So the colored boxes is supposed to represent physical risk to it. So the box's color is kind of like the physical risk of the combination. And then any kind of like up arrows, down arrows. If it's a blank, I don't really think that there's any type of psychological interaction there at all, or I haven't been able to find any information about it. So what you kind of notice with the antidepressants is that they tend to diminish effects of serotonergic psychedelics, particularly MDMA, safe with ketamine. Benzodiazepines, really across the board, decrease effects. I think that probably most doses of benzodiazepines are probably also even agreeing with ketamine, but they're both sedatives, right? So if you push the dose of benzodiazepines up high enough and push the doses of ketamine up high enough, then there probably is some place where additive sedation starts to become a concern. Same with the stimulants and opioids, really. It's mostly that stimulants and opioids just have risks in of themselves. So it's not necessarily about like the combination as much as just like, well, physically, that is a slightly riskier drug. Antipsychotics tend to not mix well with serotonergic psychedelics. They really diminish the effects of the experience, particularly the atypical ones that block serotonin 2A receptors. Interestingly, a couple of them, clozapine and risperidone, now have some data that they can decrease the effects of ketamine as well. All right, let's go ahead and take a sip of water and a deep breath, and then we're going to get into the more speculative and fun part of our program tonight. Let's see what time it is too. Okay, hurry up. Combining drugs. So when I think of combining drugs, there's a lot of different things that can happen, right? It could be a counterproductive effect. Like we saw some of that on the previous slide. It's like, okay, you add an SSRI and MDMA, they're both drugs that are serotonergic, but you don't get this way overblown serotonin type of effect because they compete with each other and they block each other's mechanism at a pharmacodynamic type of level. But spoiler alert, I don't think this is the case with any of these breakthrough psychedelics. They do not cancel each other's mechanisms out. And I would say that, pharmacodynamically or through their mechanism of action, they probably have either additive, so a 1 + 1 = 2, or possibly even a synergistic type of effect, or a 1 + 1 = 3. So I do believe that they're kind of complementary psychoactive substances, and they're going to tend to produce stronger experiences. And they may also produce higher risks than each substance alone. But I really think that the risk picture depends on the specific combination that you're using, the dose. The dose always determines whether it's going to be poisonous or not, more or less, as well as the timeline for ingesting them. So why would you want to do this? I mean, this is some crazy psychonaut business, right? I mean, we've got trials saying that MDMA works, that psilocybin works, that ketamine works. It's like, do we really need to add them all together? And it's a good question. It's a fair question. And as a pharmacist, I probably tend to be like maybe more conservative than some other people. But I do see some rationale for combining them, particularly at certain times in certain types of people. So I think that there could be a higher chance at a profound type of subjective experience. And it does seem that the mystical experience and how profound that mystical experience does map to treatment outcomes in the psilocybin research. With ketamine and dissociation, it's a little bit less clear as to whether that dissociative experience is really helping people or whether there's some other underlying neurobiological antidepressant effect that is kind of driving the bus. And I don't know, to me, it just kind of, it seems like, well, a lot of these big emotional cathartic types of events that people kind of pinpoint is like, that was the moment things changed for me. That was the moment things shift me. That was the moment when I had this epiphanic type of realization, was sort of at the crescendo of their subjective experience. It just seems to me that the subjective experience does play a role in getting people better. You know, combining them doesn't necessarily mean that you have to just jam them all together at the same time, right? You could look at the durations of action and plan an experience. It's part one substance, part another substance. And I think that that's actually kind of like, you know, I'm not suggesting people do this in this talk, but I think that the sort of like phasic approach is mostly the way to go. Allow for understanding of combined effects. So maybe you've tried these substances separately and you're really interested in what the kind of experience could be from combining them. And then I think this one's a big one for me. This last one is like reduce resistance associated with use of a signal substance. So for whatever reason, you may come across people that it seems like, okay, I gave them 4 or 5 grams of dried mushrooms. And I mean, that's enough that everyone else is kind of, weeping and crying and laughing and, in their own world for like 3 hours. And this person's kind of looking at me like, when is it going to begin? Right. So sometimes people will have this kind of resistance to particularly psilocybin, probably because it's a prodrug. There's some kind of conversion to psilocin involved, right? Or maybe they freshly tapered a pretty high dose of an antidepressant. They've been on antidepressants for a long time, and there's still some receptor downregulation going on. And it seems like you're getting a really hard time getting the serotonergic psychedelics to really have a strong type of effect from them. So, what's the contingency plan? Like how would we maybe get around this type of resistance, either by increasing the dose or maybe adding something else with a complementary type of mechanism of action that doesn't have this same type of drug interaction with those SSRI types of psychedelics. So why avoid combinations? I think that anytime you're thinking about combining these substances, it's a good idea to take a moment, take a breath, and check in with yourself and just ask, what am I trying to do here? Is this like some cavalier or heroic type of endeavor? Am I, doing this so I can tell everyone how much I did? Or, am I sort of like determined to murder my ego tonight or something like that? Like am I looking for a lesson in psychedelic humility here with this type of like combination, or is it coming from a different kind of place? I think that it can probably produce experiences that could be beyond what an individual's capacity are to navigate. I do think that psychedelics are fairly intuitive and most people can follow their experience fairly well. However, there's also like a skill set to navigating them, and just one substance alone can put a person in a place that is plenty difficult to navigate. And so when you kind of put a few of them together or a couple of them together, it could be more difficult. Safety risks and concerns. So, Mdma and ketamine, they both have cardiovascular types of effects to them and, may have some cardiovascular risk to them. So what is that sort of like underlying cardiovascular status of that person that I'm thinking of that combination for? Lack of evidence demonstrating enhanced benefits, right? So it's sort of like, again, like there's no data. Like this is why I almost like told Paul originally, it's like, I'm not talking about this, Paul. because I like to talk about things that have some information to talk about, like some data to present, some evidence to sort of like base things off of. And beyond it being incredibly common, right? I'll say this, in that a lot of the therapists, psychedelic facilitators that I'm working with in my practice through my membership, or I'm just consulting with the persons that they're planning on serving, a lot of the times a combination is planned, or the questions are about combinations. So I think that it's commonly done, and that in itself should be a good enough reason to talk about it. And then, yeah, there's clinical data supporting that a moderate dose of a single substance is enough. So it's like, why, right? Do you have some proof of concept where you've tried this other thing and it didn't work? That seems like, oh yeah, like trying a combination now may have a lot more sense than just going that way right out of the gate, because that's what you do for people. So I mentioned this sort of overlapping and complementary mechanism already. I'm not going to go back to the neurobiology. I do think it can produce a psychedelic experience that could be deeper or have greater psychological intensity. And I kind of mentioned that we're really out on a limb here as far as like, am I improving the benefits, and am I introducing some type of safety risk? And the answers there are not so clear cut overall. So thinking about like logically, combining these types of things now, well, we know that psilocybin is safe in high doses, and unless you're talking about mixing it with lithium, there's really not that much out there that's going to potentiate psilocybin in a way that makes it toxic. So when you're thinking about a combination of substances, psychologically, psilocybin may actually be the most intense one of these three breakthrough substances, but physically, it's the safest. So if you're thinking about adding something to MDMA or ketamine, and you really want to focus on safety, then psilocybin is going to be your ticket. It's also probably the longest acting one. I think of psilocybin and MDMA having fairly similar durations of action, but I think MDMA is a little bit shorter, and that oftentimes, you boost MDMA, but it's less common to boost mushrooms. They don't boost so well because you get very rapid tolerance, and the duration of action is usually enough that maybe you don't have to boost it. MDMA is safe in moderate doses, particularly when you're working with something that's high grade, and you're not just buying some type of colored pressed tablet and are unsure what it really is. If you really got good MDMA, and you're weighing out the doses, and you're using doses like they're using in clinical trials up to 180 milligrams per session, it really is fairly physically safe. Produces more of that enactogenic and pathogenic, or colloquially people would say a heart opening type of effect. So it's a very like emotionally euphoric type of experience. And, that doesn't mean that everyone that takes MDMA just has a euphoric time. Particularly it's your first time with a psychedelic and you've got treatment resistant PTSD. It could actually be a pretty difficult emotional terrain that you go through, but it does tend to have this sort of euphoric backdrop to it. It doesn't really open the same type of transpersonal types of dimensions that something like psilocybin does. And for all of these reasons, MDMA is much more popular in nightlife settings than large doses of psilocybin is. And ketamine also, as far as an anesthetic goes, it's wonderfully safe. Like there's not really any other anesthetics out there that are as safe as ketamine that I'm aware of. It's also pretty safe in moderate doses. Tends to produce more dissociative type of effects, so separating mind and body. It is a sedative and an analgesic type of substance, so it tends to make the body want to lay still as the mind goes on an experience. Whereas psilocybin and MDMA, the mind goes on an experience, but oftentimes it takes the body with it. And actually, sometimes the body is leading the experience. They can be very somatic in this type of way, and that it tends to really activate the body. People want to gag, push on certain areas, stretch or contort in some types of ways. And, these things could happen with ketamine and psychedelics. After all, there's like a range of stuff that can occur. But in general, I think of psilocybin and MDMA as sort of like body activating psychedelics. And I generally think of ketamine as more as body still sedative type of psychedelic. And it's the shortest acting one. So I think that, as far as like mixing it, okay, maybe you can introduce ketamine at some point in the experience, and it's not going to be the entire time. So designing the combination, what are my intentions? Covered that a little bit. Where am I trying to go? And the thinking of these three things, like, am I trying to go to that entheogenic transpersonal realm? Am I trying to go to that sort of, euphoric and enactogen and pathogen type of realm? Am I trying to go to a more dissociative type of realm, right? So thinking of like just the sort of basics of these substances and where I want to go when you're designing your combination. And what kinds of effects do I want to predominate? Or do I not want any type of effect to particularly predominate, right? Because, you could have 4 grams of mushrooms with 50 milligrams of MDMA. Well, geez, that's going to be primarily a mushroom type of experience. Or you could have 2 grams of mushrooms with 75 milligrams of MDMA and take them at the same time, similar duration of action. Now you're probably going to get something that, wow, I'm not even really sure if I can differentiate what is what in this experience. Maybe it seems kind of like it has the best of both worlds. And when do I want these effects to predominate? So again, you can think of things phasically instead of thinking, well, we're just going to take everything at the exact same time and we're going to get to this place, and you can plan things out. And I would really encourage people to plan things out, and particularly your first time ever attempting a combination like this is to give these experiences room to breathe and time to take a hold and effect and things like that. So you've decided on a combination, you've designed your experiences ahead of time, right? So this isn't well, we get them all out and they're all just sitting there, and then we take one thing and wait a while and then decide if we want to take more of something else. No, like I would recommend, like if you're going to attempt something like this, is to think about what you're doing ahead of time, think about what doses you want, think about what timing of it, and get it all safely prepared. It's okay to take less than planned. Just because you design this at the outset, you may get halfway into the experience and think, you know what? I feel perfect right now. I feel perfect. I feel absolutely perfect. There's no need to add anything else at that point in time. Don't change plans to take more during the experience. So you can change your plan to take less, but don't change your plan to take more. Don't take them earlier than the planned timeline. Sort of like, I was supposed to wait 2 hours to eat the mushrooms, and it's only been 45 minutes or an hour, but I'm kind of impatient. I'm ready. I think I'm just going to do it. You're kind of impatient and you're probably kind of distracted. So maybe it's time to sit and meditate and see what comes up and see what you're distracting yourself from, rather than just kind of rushing into a stronger experience. Maybe you're in a session with someone, right? And it's kind of one of these, I'm coming off of antidepressants, I've been doing a little bit of psilocybin microdosing and I feel some effect, but I have to take 0.3 of a gram to get any effect out of a microdose. Whereas it seems like most of the forums online, people are taking 0.1 of a gram. So I think I have some type of resistance to these serotonergic psychedelics still. It's like, okay, well, maybe we're going to start you with a little bit higher. Maybe I would start 3 grams of mushrooms normally. Maybe I'll start with 4 grams of mushrooms. And maybe, if we get, 2-3 hours into the experience and it's really not happening there, then I'm going to add a touch of ketamine, because I know that ketamine is compatible with those SSRI types of medications. And I know that it's going to produce a psychoactive effect. And maybe that would actually kind of crack your psilocybin experience open, and then you would actually be able to have that kind of profound experience that you're really like hoping to have. But this should all be explained ahead of time, like as far as like, if we get here, then this, right? And this is the reason that I'm doing this other thing. And, you know, this is the sort of like dosing that I'm doing. And these are the indicators that I'm going to be looking for in you and your experience to understand whether that's actually a good idea or not. You know, sometimes I hear these stories about, it's like, well, I was took these things, and then, you know, it was like 2 or 3 hours later, and like not much was happening, and the guide was kind of like panicking. So they're sort of like, here, take a bong rip, here, use something else, here, like do these types of like things. And, you know, maybe all of that would be reasonable if it was like explained ahead of time, but it's just kind of like sprung on the person in the middle of it, and it just kind of doesn't seem right that you would be introducing new interventions or substances when they may be in that sort of vulnerable, suggestible type of state, and maybe not be able to consent to things or understand what you're really even offering them or why. So psilocybin and MDMA, pretty classic candy flip or hippie flip type of combination. You know, I think a lot of people would say that MDMA can sugarcoat psilocybin types of experiences, and that maybe it improves the tolerability of some of the really intense effects. It's really hard to go to the darkest, deepest, hellish underworld that psilocybin can sometimes take people to when there's a little bit of MDMA in the background. Or if you are going to go to that dark place, you can kind of do it with a little bit more of a smile on your face, perhaps. You know, both have similar durations of action, so they could be used either simultaneously or with fairly short staggering, right? Because if you start waiting, well, I'm going to take MDMA, and then 4 hours later, I'm going to take psilocybin. It's like, well, your psilocybin experience is going to be characterized by an MDMA come down. And that may not be the most optimal psychological place to be at that time. So if you're going to be staggering these things, you know, you probably kind of stagger them close together. Consider reducing the doses of each substances when combining. So I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that, you know, maybe you have someone that does have a little bit more cardiovascular risk and or doesn't want to use a very high dose of MDMA. And so you reduce the dose. Instead of doing your 100 to 125 to start, you do more like 70 to 80 to start. And you could have your booster of 25 to 30 prepared. So pretty low dose of MDMA. Really, it's like 100 milligrams and change total for their experience, but adding a couple grams of mushrooms at the outset or the get-go may really provide a pretty big experience for that person still. So you may actually be able to use combinations, because again, I think of psilocybin as so physically safe, and combining with MDMA, there's nothing that I've been able to come across in literature that suggests that that's all of a sudden makes psilocybin more dangerous, right? So I think that in some ways, you know, that could be a way of reducing some of the undesirable effects of MDMA. Mdma and ketamine is a really popular one amongst therapists that I talk to that are doing this type of work. I get questions about it kind of regularly. And really, it creates an open heart and a dissociated mind. So it's like just a pure heart experience, because your mind is off somewhere else, but your heart is just completely open from the MDMA. So it tends to be expansive. It tends to be euphoric. It probably has some additive cardiovascular risks in combination, because you're talking about two drugs that do increase blood pressure and heart rates fairly significantly in of themselves, and, you know, drugs that, well, geez, if you really push the doses high enough or you use people with high levels of cardiovascular illness, then, you know, tragedies have occurred. So I'll say that this combination is probably not for the faint of heart. Both are reinforcing substances and have some addictive potential. So this probably goes into like how euphoric it really kind of is. Right, but you may, you know, particularly if you're combining doses in recreational types of settings for playtime and things like that, you may be find yourself with this tendency or temptation to redose or try to recreate experiences, because it can be very pleasurable to combine MDMA and ketamine. And it's probably reasonable to wait until after the peak of the MDMA experience to introduce ketamine. So again, MDMA is a 3 to 4 hour type of thing. You can boost it, one time. So probably take that initial dose of MDMA, or 100 to 125 milligrams, and wait 3 or 4 hours. Take the booster 2.5 hours in, maybe an hour, hour and a half after taking the booster. That's maybe when you want to introduce ketamine. So you've had almost all of your MDMA experience. Maybe there's another hour and a half or 2 hours left on the booster, and it's just enough time for a couple of rounds of ketamine. And again, I think that there's something to do with MDMA is really heart opening, but it's body activating. So it's you've had that sort of activated body emotional experience with MDMA, and now you can rest and kind of go deeper into your mind. And a lot of the really shaky, energetic types of stuff that these body activating psychedelics will have passed by that period of time, and the body will be very comfortable and want to lay still at that point in the person's experience. Again, reasonable to use lower doses. Psilocybin and ketamine is a little bit less common. It creates a really mind-based or dream-like experience with intense hallucinations. So it's got all the sort of transpersonal and even sort of heightened, intense types of visual hallucinations when combined with ketamine. And it tends to be just watching something inside of your mind, because again, the body is taken out of it a little bit by the ketamine. It's probably reasonable, again, to wait until after the peak of the psilocybin experience. So kind of letting either psilocybin or MDMA have room to breathe and come to a peak and get to whatever sort of cathartic thoughts or body action or emotional expression that serotonergic psychedelic is guiding the person to, and then using ketamine kind of on the back end of things. So what about all three? Can you do it? Of course you can. May be more reasonable to try when experienced with each substance alone or in simple combinations. Again, take it slow, go phasically. Give them, particularly MDMA and psilocybin, time to come to peak effects before you start adding other things. And these are the types of combinations that could really open purely otherworldly dimensions of consciousness. You're still thinking that reality is based upon physical things. This combination may change your mind. You may sort of be wow, I think consciousness is the basis of reality, after the types of experiences that combining all three of them can have. And I'll say, are we still in the therapeutic zone here, or are we in sort of psychonautic territory? That's for you in the audience to really decide. So psychedelic protocols of the future, and they really could be psychedelic protocols of the present. It just wouldn't be necessarily legal to do this in present times. But there's certainly practices that are going on like this. So maybe you've got someone with depression or PTSD, and they're taking those SSRI or SNRI types of antidepressant substances, and they have their heart set on MDMA assisted therapy or psilocybin assisted therapy, but that that's going to be sort of an uphill battle for them, because they've been taking the SSRIs for a long time. They're not in a great place mood-wise at the moment. That tapering and withdrawing from that could knock them down a rung as well. So perhaps you start a slow taper of your antidepressant, and you could use some ketamine sessions just right off the bat, just to give them some experience with a non-ordinary state of consciousness, potentially improve their mood or some of their trauma symptoms, even while they're going through their SSRI or SNRI types of taper. I have less to say about the efficacy of microdosing, but a lot of people are anecdotally reporting that it's helpful in transitioning away from SSRIs or SNRIs, or can help with some of the serotonergic withdrawal effects. Again, this is speculative. I don't really have any data except for persons that have told me that it helped them in that way. And then you get to kind of your really, I would say, like the bigger kind of like planned experiences. And, maybe it's trauma that you're working with, and you want to start them out softly because they are pretty much psychedelic naive when they came to you. And they have a little bit of ketamine under the belt, but they've never taken a serotonergic psychedelic. So you could start with standard doses of MDMA, and around booster time, if they're doing well, maybe you could introduce a little bit of psilocybin mushrooms at that point, just to give it a bit of a twist, just to give it kind of a hint of mystical and spiritual types of effects and qualities towards the very end of their MDMA journey. Now, experience 2, a month, maybe 6 weeks later, you're starting with 100 milligrams of MDMA plus 2 grams of dried mushrooms. So now you're kind of like, that's kind of hippie flip, candy flip type of a territory where it could be quite mystical and transpersonal, but you've still really got a pretty good MDMA backbone to the experience. It's probably hard for them to go and just dwell in the underworld. It's hard for the rails to come completely off the tracks. And then you can use a regular booster of MDMA 2.5 hours later. And now they tolerated that well, things are going well. Okay, maybe experience 3, they're ready to try something that is more predominantly mushrooms. So maybe 3 to 4 grams of dried mushrooms off the bat, and just give them a good amount of time to experience what psilocybin mushrooms are in and of themselves. Maybe you want to wait something like 3 hours to add any type of MDMA. And maybe if you do add it, it's going to be 50 or 75 milligrams. And so it's almost like a flip-flop of experience. One now is you're giving a kind of a touch of MDMA towards the end or after the mushrooms have peaked. And, they want to end their day, or they are curious. Maybe you want to try a little bit of ketamine at that point, either intranasally or intramuscularly. So, I kind of think of ketamine as, if you're doing these combinations, sort of like at the end of the day, like after you're done, MDMA or psilocybin, either alone or in some combination with each other, kind of 4 hours after that initial ingestment, maybe 1.5, 2 hours after booster time. That's when I would, potentially introduce ketamine. But there's nothing wrong, right, with sticking to a single substance, particularly when it's yielding great results. And just because I wrote this sort of theoretical plan out on a slide doesn't mean that I would just like, that's the winner and that's like the one that's going to do it for every single person. And it's sort of like listening to the person. What are their experiences like? Where do they want to go? What are they gravitated towards? Do they even like these ideas of these synthetic types of psychedelics like ketamine, or they're like, I like naturally occurring things, and I'm looking for alternative health solutions here. And okay, like listen to all of those things as far as designing the experience. And it's okay to push back and say like, well, I think ketamine's a wonderful medicine, and I think you may get more out of the experience because you still have some resistance from your antidepressant. Right? It's okay to like give a little pushback, but really think about the person and what they want, what they're desiring, and ask them what they want. All right. So combining psychedelics is commonly done. It lacks data supporting safety or that improves outcomes. Different psychedelics offer different things in combinations and could be novel, intense, or profound with blended elements of the individual substances. And I think as you're thinking about combinations, careful design, planning, supportive guidance, it's especially important when you're attempting a combination, and of utmost importance if it's the very first time that you're attempting that kind of combination. So if you liked this talk, you've already supported the Psychedelia Integration Fund tonight just by attending, and I thank you so much for that. But you can always donate more. They are a 501c3 nonprofit. The donations are tax deductible. The year end is here, so it is donation season. And there's, really, in my mind, donating to community-based organizations that are out there trying to make the psychedelic experience and support services around the psychedelic experience affordable, equitable across our society. I mean, this is a huge mission, and needs your support. So if you would like to, if you want to share the link with somebody, that would be pretty wonderful. I'll also say that I have an antidepressant tapering and drug interaction guide that is also like freely available for download. So maybe you have the slides from tonight, but maybe you want like a guide about tapering antidepressants, something that explains quite a bit more about the effects in combination. So I'm just going to put the psychedelia integration link there into the chat box in case anyone wants to utilize that right now. And then I'm also putting this antidepressant tapering guide into the chat box, so you can go there, and you have to sign up to my email list, but you do get to download your free copy, and you can unsubscribe immediately if you just never want to hear from me ever again. That's fine. I hope you stay. At this time, I think we had about an hour and a half planned, so I don't have a ton of time, but I do have some time for question and answer.
Thanks so much, Ben, for that awesome talk. You got a lot more into the combinations than I was expecting, which was really fantastic.
I did it just for you, Paul.
I love it.
I did not have these slides prepared, and I just made them for Paul, because Paul does such wonderful work with psychedelia, and he's so dedicated. And every board meeting, we're like, Paul, pay yourself. And he's like, nah, I forgot again.
Trying to keep it all, supportive and going. So, I just wanted to highlight briefly, a couple things from your talk that I think are just extra important. Just need a little extra highlight. One,
there you go,
is the consent piece. You mentioned at one point about planning ahead for these combinations and knowing what you're going for with people if you're sitting for someone or working with someone, and when they're already under the influence, now that would not be the time to say, well, let's try this and that, because there really isn't that. The consent is such a big issue now in psychedelic space with regard to a lot of issues besides what medicines you're taking. So that piece, and then also the other thing about which you mentioned a few times, which I think people just forget, and it could be totally fun to do the combinations, but if you're getting great results and one medicine is working fine, just note that, really keep in mind what the purposes are. So those two little things I just wanted to highlight. And then to start off the questions, I had an experience with MDMA where it was just so fear-inducing. And I think actually the dose, which was a normal dose, like 125 milligrams, was just too high. And so that thought of mixing in ketamine to lowering the dose and then doing a little ketamine more at the beginning, might help that kind of a situation, depending, and your thoughts on that, along with the same idea would be for people that might get a lot of fear-based somatic responses with psilocybin. Also doing maybe something like ketamine to kind of take that edge off, would that, as you kind of alluded to, help loosen it up so that they could then have more of a mystical type experience, or have that more of an option for that?
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, like, that's what I'm saying. It's like this part about combinations, it was pretty like, well, I mean, it's like I'm using like pharmacologic logic, right, about like the durations of action and like what I think the predominating subjective sort of effect of each substance is. But yeah, we're talking about psychedelics, we're talking about mind manifesting things, we're talking about substances that are notorious for the range of things that can happen to people, and for delivering experiences that are pretty personally meaningful for them. So I do think that, working on someone to get them to a place where they're really trusting the environment and working on whatever preoccupations that they have ahead of time to get them into a really relaxed type of state is helpful. And yeah, it's like there's different levels to the ketamine experience too. There's levels that, there's a lot of talk therapy happening with ketamine now, right? Where they're using a sublingual lozenge of ketamine and actually doing like an actual talk therapy session where it's like just dreamy and lucid, but they're not necessarily dissociated at all in that type of state, right? So the idea of like, well, yeah, getting someone to fully relax with a small dose of ketamine or a ketamine lozenge psychotherapy session preceding going into some type of deeper work doesn't sound unreasonable.
Great. Sounds great. So who, if someone has a question, I guess you could put it in the chat and I'll spotlight you if you're comfortable with that, whoever that might be.
So I think
Well, I see some hands raised too.
Yeah, let's go with the hands raised. So how about Ginny and Mark? I've got you guys first here. Let me add you guys.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I had a couple quick questions. One is if you could say something about the frequency of MDMA in terms of safety or neurotoxicity. And then the second one would there be as much therapeutic benefit from psilocybin if you're adding the MDMA? Is there anything to indicate that therapeutic benefit of psilocybin would be any less because you're adding MDMA?
Yeah, so the first part of the question about like MDMA and neurotoxicity, it seems like the doses that they're using in clinical trials and the frequency they're using has not produced any type of noticeable long-term neurocognitive type of effect. So the doses that they're using are up to 180 milligrams per session. They're using up to a 187.5 in phase 2. So I'm just going to say 200, right? Doses less than 200 milligrams per session, starting at 100 to 120, boosting 50 to 80, things like that are, pretty reasonable, and that they're not going to lead to long-term neurotoxic types of things. And spacing the MDMA sessions a solid month apart, at least 3 weeks, probably more like 3 to 6 weeks apart is a pretty reasonable time frame. People do notice some after effects, and even in the clinical trials, they tend to resolve within 5 to 7 days. And whatever after effects they're noticing, they're also noticing that they feel much better symptomatically from the PTSD, which tends to sort of like outweigh those types of effects for them overall. But there's different people out there, and some people may have tried MDMA many times in the past in different types of settings and said that it really does affect them, and they want to use smaller doses. Or maybe you just give a standard dose to someone and they get knocked hard for like a week and a half afterwards, and your instinct is just kind of like, I'm not sure if this is the medicine for them. I'm not sure, particularly if they've used MDMA a few times, and this after effect or this come down effect tends to get worse each time and last longer each time. That would be sort of my signal, is like, no matter what dose or frequency, change directions. The second part of your question is like, I don't know the answer, right? Like, I don't know if adding MDMA to psilocybin really helps things. I don't know if it robs them of some special part of the psilocybin experience where they're going to be having some just horrible, difficult, negative emotion, and that was what that person needed. But because we gave them this sort of euphoric backbone with MDMA, that they didn't quite get to there or something like that. So I would just say that, yeah, it's kind of right, like experiencing each substance individually has a lot of merit to it. And then the person may be able to direct themselves as to far as like, well, do I want that naked psilocybin experience again? Or do I want to maybe reduce the dose of it a little bit and add a little bit of MDMA as a cushion and see if that works better for me?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next.
You got
have-
Amy.
Great, Amy, right. Okay, Amy, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It's been
Thank
great.
you.
Yeah, so I think part of the question has been answered before, just about psilocybin and ketamine together. But I've noticed really specific stages in psilocybin journeys, especially like the last 4 that I've guided, intense anxiety, to the point of, I don't want to be here. Can you do something to reverse this? I want to leave, that kind of stuff, very curious. So I'm just thinking how beneficial this would be in the front, ketamine, kind of right off the bat. And I was wondering what dosage you think could be appropriate.
Well, what do you do when people have this experience of like intense anxiety, like panicking, I want to leave?
And they're
Like, how do you help them with that?
Well, because it's such a somatic medicine, I just encourage them to move their body or do whatever they need to do to kind of work it through, work it out. They don't need to be still if they don't want to be, but also just, holding their hand and being there, being a safe person, letting them know that I'm there to go with it, go into the journey with them. They're not alone. Doing breath work is also very helpful. But I can just see how beneficial this could be for people going through, especially people that haven't experienced a psychedelic before.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like, it gets into some like super interesting territory, right? About like, what about these experiences, whether it be horrible anxiety, it's kind of like Hopkins, for example, is like the mystical experiences associated with these outcomes, right? But I'm not sure if they're doing much in the way of analysis as far as, are the negative emotions that people experience also associated with these types of outcomes? Because transient anxiety is incredibly common during that psilocybin type of experience. And is it optimal to do something ahead of time that may mitigate that, right? And sort of like, okay, we'll use ketamine as an anxiolytic ahead of time. And it'll take the edge off. And it's like, so will Xanax. Should we do that, right? Like, or there was one recent trial that was just released, like, I don't know, like this week, like 10 days ago or something like that, that gave people 2 weeks of an SSRI and then gave them psilocybin. It was the first trial that's ever been published of antidepressants with psilocybin. And it's probably not the greatest design to understand what are the effects of SSRIs with psilocybin, because SSRIs are the types of drugs that take months to work. So giving someone for 2 weeks and then looking at the effect, it's kind of like, what are we hoping to understand? Because that's probably not enough time for the SSRI to really produce whatever effect it's going to produce. And what they found is that it did not reduce the positive aspects of the psilocybin experience in any way, shape, or form, but it seemed to attenuate the negative effects or the anxious, ego dissolutive types of effects of the psilocybin experience. So you get into like some really interesting questions and territory around what is a side effect of psilocybin. Like, are these like horrible anxiety-ridden moments side effects? Are they bad trips? Are they challenging experiences that ultimately translate into something that's making them a better person, right? Or are we just making people suffer through really difficult emotional things that they don't actually have to like suffer through to get the types of benefits that the substances can ultimately provide? I think
it's a good question. I've seen people really get through the negative and then they integrate it into the positive. Like, if I can get through that, I can get through anything. If I felt like I was going to die in that journey, I can get through anything in my life after that. So I've actually seen it kind of be transformative in a way.
Yeah, you've seen it both ways, right?
Yeah, I've seen it
Like,
both
there's
ways.
like post-traumatic growth syndrome
Yeah.
and there's post-traumatic stress,
Yeah.
right? So it's
Yeah.
sort of like, yeah, it's like, which way is this really challenging experience going to go?
Right.
You know, and it comes down to maybe some of the integration support, that person's own resilience, like what they were thinking about the guide and things like that. Like, yeah. Good one, Amy.
Yeah, good stuff. Thank you.
I think that there was one question in the chat box here, or maybe a few.
It was a little bit farther back. It was Gregory. He said, what would you say about a tolerance developing with MDMA? I think I said that correctly.
Well, it shouldn't be a strong tolerance. Like, you know, if you dose MDMA over and over again in the same evening, yeah, by the third dose, you get a tolerance to it and you just jack up the physical cardiovascular risks and you feel awful. And so that's why only one booster with MDMA, but it's like, it shouldn't really produce the type of tolerance where it's like, yeah, I was using 100 milligrams of MDMA every month, every 2 months, and now that doesn't do anything for me. I got to do 180 milligrams. Like, it shouldn't really produce a tolerance that's kind of like steep. You know, I think that there's many different mechanisms of tolerance out there, and sort of like once you've done something and you kind of like there may be like an expectation based tolerance or like a behavioral tolerance that occurs that's not necessarily physical.
There's a related,
yeah.
I was going to say, there's a related question here. How do you know if you need a booster of MDMA versus just the first dose? Someone's asking. Jenny and Mark are asking that.
Yeah, you know, how do you know you need a booster? Well, you usually don't. Like, I would say like this, right, is that MDMA, a lot of sources will say that the duration of action is 4 to 6 hours, but I actually believe that it's shorter than that for most people, in that usually by 60 to 90 minutes, you're kind of entering the peak of an MDMA experience, and you really only have 60 to 90 minutes at the peak of the experience. So usually by hour 3.5 or 4, people will actually begin to notice the substance wearing off. So the booster, right, is probably not meant to really take the person too much deeper, maybe a little bit deeper, but not too much deeper. And it's probably meant to plateau the peak effects of the substance. So it's been 2 hours, 2.5 hours per the clock. That is probably enough time for the experience to have peaked, and probably per your subjective feeling too, you're kind of like, yeah, I think it has peaked. I think I've arrived. Right. And so at that time, you may choose to take a booster basically with the knowledge that I like where I'm at right now, and I want to stay in this place for another 3 hours, rather than I like where I'm at right now, but you know, I would like it to stop in an hour and a half or so, and I would like to kind of come down at that point in time. So the booster is not mandatory, right? You can take 1 dose of MDMA and it's fine, but I think that people tend to take the booster because it really sort of plateaus the place where they have access to a lot of really great emotional things.
One thing I can note about some of that dosage with the MAPS people, I was on a call with Marcella, who's the head therapist over there at MAPS, and she said that they give everyone, the first dose is like 70 to 80 milligrams, and then they give the booster of exactly half of whatever the dose is. And they do that specifically in the window of 1.5 hours to 2 hours. And once it's the 2 hour passes, if they haven't taken if they don't want the booster, then that's it. As far as that's their study design related to the booster piece.
I think that sound too is kind of like, have a booster window, like hours 2 to 3.5. That's the booster window. But you can't wait 5 hours and then be like, I'm ready for the booster now, because that's not fair to your guide.
Right. Yeah, exactly. All of a sudden you're there for twice as long. Yeah, and what you were talking about with Amy was really interesting. In a trauma-informed sense, even without psychedelics, you want people to get in touch with those feelings that they've, kept under wraps or weren't allowed to experience when they were younger. And so I'm curious as if you were to somehow bypass those negative feelings, like we were talking about, you know, can that really mitigate? And then there's the point of view relatedly that the mystical experience is more of a resource for people that can be very powerful and healing, but not necessarily clear or cure your trauma. So just to add a little more question marks in there to how this all works.
There was another question in the chat a little bit earlier from Jamie Ramirez saying, I understand the concept of neurons that fire together, wire together, but would love to hear an elaboration on how this is relevant to the effects of ketamine.
Well, yeah, I was talking about it specifically with like ketamine because the long-term pre-potentiation mechanism that I was discussing was essentially a glutamate-based synaptic plasticity mechanism. Glutamate is the major excitatory and neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. So there's way more glutamate neurons than serotonin neurons, for example. And basically, ketamine has this effect where it can disinhibit glutamate release in these parts of the cortex, like the layer 5 pyramidal cells. And this leads to more AMPA channels, right? So the signal becomes stronger, you get more neurotrophic factors. And then that's the thing that, synaptogenesis or spinogenesis, like neurons are looking for new connections to one another, or like neurogenesis, right? So it's like a learning mechanism that ultimately makes signals stronger through this kind of feedback mechanism of like AMPA channel insertion or deletion. Yeah, the opposite can occur too. LTD, or long-term depression, is what it's called. But I just put LTP in this slide deck because it seemed more relevant.
So Ben, just checking with you on your time. How are you? Do you want to take a few more, or how's it going? Because we're a little past your time right now. So
let's do 6 more minutes.
Okay. So we have another, let's see, anyone else have their hand up wants to pop on? And we have, I think, another question or so in the chat.
We got Laureen here. So she says, I recently weaned off Nardil, which is phenelzine. It's a monoamine oxidase inhibitor type of antidepressant about 2 weeks ago. And now weaning off 2 milligrams of Atidan per day down to a little over 1 milligram. Tried 3 grams of albino Avery, and it did nothing. Really struggling with depression, anxiety. What could I try next? So I'll say that monoamine oxidase inhibitors, you talk about them, people may hear about them in the world of psychedelics through ayahuasca, right? And it's like acute use of an MAOI, just dosing it once or twice, like those Harmala MAOIs, they boost the effects of DMT. They make it orally bioavailable. That's what ayahuasca is. But they also boost the effects of things like psilocybin. It's called like pharmahuasca. But when people are taking pharmaceutical monoamine oxidase inhibitors, they've been exposed to it chronically for a long time. What actually happens is that you get something similar to those SSRIs. You get like receptor down regulation types of events. So being off of it for about 2 weeks, because Nardil essentially irreversibly binds monoamine oxidase. So it takes about 2 weeks for you to even make new monoamine oxidase. I would just say that you probably still have some resistance to psilocybin from monoamine oxidase inhibitor use if it's really only been 2 weeks. And lorazepam or Ativan is another substance, a benzodiazepine, that can reduce or diminish the effects of all 3 of them, really, MDMA, psilocybin, or ketamine. So I would say that tincture of time right? It's probably going to make the psilocybin work better. The farther you can get on the benzodiazepine, go careful, go slow on that. 2 milligrams of Ativan down to just over 1, you're doing great, right? But there's no race to the finish line with those benzodiazepines. They can be pretty tricky, and you've already got off the MAOI. So I would say at this point in time, maybe try some ketamine, right? That would probably work, probably deliver a non-ordinary state of consciousness. Could be quite beneficial. Maybe the Ativan is still hindering things a little bit, but not too bad at just over 1 milligram of Ativan. And keep trying. You know, you could take, if you have more of this psilocybin mushrooms, this variety, albino, Avery, you could try something that's more than a microdose, but not a large dose. 0.4 of a gram, 0.5 of a gram, you know, every other Sunday, when you have a few hours to yourself, you can listen to music or meditate or journal or just spend some time thinking or reflecting about yourself, and just keep checking. Like, do I notice something yet? Was there some type of change in my thoughts yet? Do things feel a little bit looser yet, right? And I think that you'll find that the longer you're off that MAOI, the more that you kind of get out of it.
Great. I think, has this been asked already about the monthly or bi-monthly doses of 125 milligrams, if there's going to be a tolerance?
There shouldn't be much of a tolerance.
Yeah. And looks like one last, oh, wait, we have some hands up here. How about Winslow? Let's go ahead, Winslow.
Am I unmuted?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So I have a lot of people who could really benefit from psychedelic therapy who have tried it before. And I have like 2 questions. Are the psychedelic integration circles still happening? Are they virtual, or are they in person? That's question number 1, which is probably simply answered.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they are, and they're online, and they will be soon. But we're slowly starting to have some in-person ones. But we've got 7 circles every month right now, and we're adding more.
The other question I have to ask is for myself. It's rather complex. It might not be answerable. I recently came back from a life-threatening bacterial illness, not COVID, but something that almost killed me. And I'm faced with some intense social challenges like poverty and houselessness. So I was thinking of doing not microdosing, but the next stage up, lower than a museum dose every, I don't know, every 5 days or so, as a means of obtaining behavioral strength faced with social challenges. And in other words, like maybe whatever would be the mushroom tea equivalent of 1/8 of a hit of acid. So could you comment on that?
I'll say that, you know, it sounds like you're bouncing back from some pretty serious like illness. And then there's also this like greater context of it sounded like life situation types of like stuff, like housing and things like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think like a couple keys, right, to psychedelics really working well is to have like some level of stability and support network set up for yourself, and then some type of program or structure in place. So it doesn't have to be like I get checked into some program. It can be a program that you design yourself, right? But you probably should involve like some other sorts of like support features to keep you going in the direction that you're hoping to go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Time's up.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ben, for being here. Thanks again so much, Ben, for your wisdom. A fantastic talk. You know, everyone's, silently clapping.
Thank you for everyone that came and attended, and supporting psychedelic integration is just a wonderful thing to do.